Officers humiliate an elderly man in a cafe, but then they see this on his table and are shocked. Liam Carter, a 76-year-old war veteran, sat quietly at a small table tucked into the corner of a lively cafe. His presence was unassuming, almost invisible amid the buzz of the mid-morning crowd. He wore a well-worn jacket that had weathered countless winters, and his sturdy boots hinted at years of reliable use. Everything about him was modest yet tidy, a reflection of a man who valued simplicity and dignity over extravagance. His hands, calloused and strong despite his age, rested on a steaming cup of coffee. It wasn't the fanciest drink on the menu, just a plain black brew, but it was enough for him. Liam had learned long ago how to appreciate life's smaller comforts. He sat patiently, his eyes occasionally drifting toward the cafe door. Ethan, his only son, had promised to meet him for lunch. Liam smiled faintly at the thought, even as the minutes ticked by, and Ethan's delay grew longer. The cafe around him was a whirlwind of energy, friends chatting, laughter echoing, the comforting clatter of dishes being washed in the background. Most people were too busy with their own lives to notice the quiet man in the corner. But if they had stopped for even a moment, they might have seen the quiet strength in his posture, the calm wisdom in his gaze. Liam was not just another elderly man sipping coffee. He was a veteran, a man who had once stood in the face of unimaginable danger for the sake of others. Yet today wasn't about the past. It wasn't about medals or service or memories of battles long since fought. Today, Liam was simply a father, waiting to catch up with his son. What Liam didn't know, what no one in the cafe could have guessed, was that this peaceful moment was about to be shattered. Soon, his quiet strength would be tested in a way that went beyond anything he had faced before. Two men were about to walk through that door, and their actions would turn this ordinary day into a moment of public humiliation and unexpected revelation. The cheerful clamor of the cafe came to an abrupt pause as the door swung open with a jingle of the bell. Two officers, Detective Mark Grayson and Officer Ryan Hayes, stepped in, their presence commanding attention without a word. Their polished boots echoed against the tiled floor as they surveyed the room, their sharp gazes scanning for an available table. Mark, the taller and more assertive of the two, had a habit of walking into a space as if he owned it. His uniform was immaculate, every detail polished to perfection. Ryan, his junior partner, followed closely behind, a subtle smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, as if he found some private amusement in everything around him. It didn't take long for their attention to land on Liam, sitting alone in the corner. To them, his presence was out of place. The cafe was in an upscale part of town, frequented by professionals, well-dressed couples, and families enjoying a leisurely brunch. Liam, with his simple attire and weathered appearance, stood out like a misplaced thread in an otherwise pristine fabric. Mark leaned toward Ryan, muttering something under his breath. Whatever he said was enough to make Ryan chuckle, a low, mocking laugh that drew the attention of a few nearby patrons. The two officers exchanged a knowing look before making their way toward Liam's table. As they approached, their demeanor shifted. Mark took the lead, standing tall and looming over the elderly man. Without so much as a greeting, his tone was sharp and demanding. "Mind telling us what you're doing here?" he asked, his words cutting through the air like a blade. Liam looked up slowly, his calm eyes meeting Mark's with an unflinching gaze. "I'm waiting for my son," he said simply, his voice steady and polite. Ryan snorted. "Your son? In a place like this?" he quipped, his tone dripping with sarcasm. He gestured vaguely around the cafe. "Doesn't exactly seem like your kind of crowd, old man." The insult hung in the air, drawing a few furtive glances from other customers. Most quickly turned away, pretending not to notice. Liam, however, remained calm. He had faced worse in his lifetime and wasn't about to let two arrogant officers break his composure. "I'm just here for a coffee," he replied, his voice unshaken, same as anyone else. But his measured response seemed to irritate Mark further. The detective stepped closer, his imposing figure now blocking out the light from the nearby window. "You got ID?" he demanded, his tone making it clear this wasn't a casual request, but an order meant to assert his authority. Liam reached into his jacket pocket, his movements deliberate and steady, and pulled out his veteran's ID. It was a simple card, worn at the edges, but it carried with it a lifetime of service and sacrifice. He handed it to Mark without a word. Mark took the card, glanced at it briefly, then smirked. "This could be fake," he said loudly enough for others to hear. The statement wasn't a question, it was a dismissal, as if the idea of Liam being a veteran was laughable to him. He tossed the card back onto the table with casual indifference. Ryan joined in, leaning against the table with a grin. "A veteran? You? Come on, old man. Back in your day, people like you probably shined boots or scrubbed floors, not fought wars." His words were laced with cruelty, designed to provoke, but Liam didn't rise to the bait. He sat still, his hands folded in front of him, his expression unchanged. "I'm just waiting for my son," he repeated. His calmness was a quiet act of defiance, one that only seemed to fuel the officer's disdain. Around the cafe, the atmosphere had shifted. Conversations had hushed, and all eyes were now on the unfolding scene. Some customers watched with concern, others with discomfort, but none had the courage to step in. Liam was alone, facing not just the officers, but the silent complicity of everyone around him. For Mark and Ryan, this wasn't just a power play, it was a performance. But for Liam, it was a moment of quiet resistance, a refusal to be reduced by their arrogance. He had faced tougher battles in his life, and he wasn't about to let two young men with badges take away his dignity. What none of them knew was that the situation was far from over. What was happening now was only the beginning, and the truth about who Liam was would soon change everything. Mark didn't take his eyes off Liam as he grabbed the veteran's ID from the table. He held it up for a moment, turning it in his hand with exaggerated skepticism, as if inspecting it for signs of forgery. The smirk on his face widened. "Seriously, this is it?" he scoffed. "This little piece of plastic is supposed to prove you're some kind of war hero? Please." With a flick of his wrist, he tossed the card back onto the table where it landed face down, teetering on the edge. Liam, calm as ever, reached forward and gently placed the card back in his pocket. His movements were slow, deliberate, and full of restraint. He had no intention of giving them the reaction they were clearly looking for. Ryan, however, wasn't satisfied. He leaned in closer, his tone dripping with mockery. "I gotta say, old man, you've got some nerve coming into a place like this, acting like you belong here. What, you think because you've got some phony veteran card, people are just gonna roll out the red carpet for you?" Liam didn't respond. He simply folded his hands in his lap and kept his eyes steady. This wasn't the first time he'd faced disrespect, and he knew that sometimes the most powerful response was no response at all. But his silence only seemed to infuriate Mark further. "What's the matter?" the detective said, stepping closer. "Cat got your tongue? Or are you just ignoring me?" His voice grew louder, enough to make several customers glance nervously in their direction. Ryan snickered, crossing his arms as he leaned casually against the table. "Guess he thinks he's too good to talk to us," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. The tension in the cafe was palpable now. Conversations had stopped entirely, replaced by the uneasy sound of forks clinking against plates as customers pretended not to notice the escalating confrontation. A few people exchanged worried glances, but no one stepped forward. Mark wasn't done. He loomed over Liam, his voice dropping to a low, threatening growl. "Let me make this simple for you. Either you tell us what you're really doing here, or we're gonna have to assume you're up to no good. And trust me, you don't want us to start assuming things." Still, Liam didn't flinch. He met Mark's gaze with a calmness that seemed to unnerve the younger man. Finally, Liam spoke, his voice steady and unshaken. "I told you I'm just waiting for my son." Mark's jaw tightened. For a moment, it seemed like he might back down, but then he glanced around the cafe, noticing the eyes of the other customers on him. He wasn't about to lose face. Not here, not in front of an audience. "All right, old man," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Let's see some proof. Show me your ID again, or better yet, why don't you just get up and leave? This place isn't for people like you." Ryan laughed, his voice loud and grating. "Yeah, unless you're here to clean tables or something. In that case, grab a rag and get to work." The cruelty of their words hung heavy in the air. Liam, however, remained still. He reached into his pocket once more, pulling out his ID and handing it over without a word. This time, Mark snatched it out of his hand, holding it up like a trophy as he turned to Ryan. "Look at this," Mark said, shaking his head. "This guy really expects us to believe he's some kind of hero. Give me a break." Ryan leaned in, pretending to examine the card. "Yeah, right," he said with a sneer. "Back in his day, they probably just gave these out to anyone who asked for one." The laughter that followed was cruel and cutting, but it didn't touch Liam. He had faced far worse than this. He had stared down enemies in battle, endured pain and loss that these young men couldn't begin to imagine. He wasn't going to let their words break him now, but the humiliation wasn't over yet. Mark tossed the ID back onto the table, this time letting it slide off and fall to the floor. "Oops," he said, feigning innocence. "Guess you'd better pick that up, old man." The cafe fell silent. All eyes were on Liam as he bent slowly to retrieve his ID, his movements deliberate and dignified. He straightened up, placed the card back in his pocket, and returned to his seat without a word. For Mark and Ryan, this was just a game, a way to assert their power and entertain themselves at someone else's expense. But for Liam, it was something much deeper. He wasn't just enduring their insults, he was showing them, and everyone else in the cafe, the strength of quiet dignity. What neither of the officers realized was that their actions were being closely watched. The truth about who Liam was, and the consequences of their behavior, was about to come crashing down on them in a way they never could have expected. The air in the cafe grew heavier with each passing moment. Customers sat frozen in their seats, their food forgotten, their conversations silenced. All eyes were on the corner where Liam Carter, the quiet veteran, now found himself at the mercy of two officers who seemed determined to push him past his breaking point. Mark's patience, or lack thereof, was wearing thin. He loomed over Liam like a predator circling its prey, his tone dripping with barely restrained hostility. "I'm giving you one last chance, old man," he said, leaning in so close that Liam could feel his breath. "Get up and leave, or we'll drag you out ourselves." Liam didn't budge. His hands rested firmly on the table, and his calm, steady gaze met Mark's with a quiet defiance. "I have every right to be here," he said, his voice measured and firm. "I'm not causing trouble. I'm just waiting for my son." Mark straightened, his lips curling into a sneer. "You think you can just sit there and tell us what you will or won't do?" He glanced over at Ryan, who was now standing with his arms crossed, a smug grin plastered across his face. "This guy really doesn't get it, does he?" Ryan said, shaking his head mockingly. "I say we stop wasting time and show him we mean business." Mark nodded, his eyes narrowing as he took a step closer to Liam. Then, with a sudden burst of aggression, he grabbed the chair next to Liam's and shoved it aside. The loud crash as it hit the floor made the entire cafe jump. The sound echoed like a gunshot, cutting through the tense silence and causing several customers to gasp audibly. A woman near the door instinctively clutched her purse, while a young man seated by the counter looked away, his face pale with discomfort. Still, Liam didn't flinch. He remained seated, his composure unshaken. But Mark wasn't done. He moved closer, his hand hovering near his holstered weapon, a calculated gesture meant to intimidate. "All right, tough guy," he said, his voice cold and menacing. "Let's see what you're hiding." Without waiting for permission, Mark reached out and began patting Liam down, his movements rough and invasive. The search was unnecessary. Mark wasn't looking for anything. He was trying to humiliate Liam further. Ryan stood to the side, smirking as he watched. "Careful, Mark," he said sarcastically. "You never know, the old man might be packing something dangerous, like a knitting needle or a pair of dentures." The remark drew a few stifled chuckles from a couple of onlookers who quickly regretted laughing. Most of the cafe remained silent, their unease palpable. As Mark continued the aggressive search, Liam lifted his hands slightly, not in surrender, but as a precaution. He knew better than to make any sudden moves around men like this. Calm and control were his best defenses, and he wasn't about to let them rob him of either. Mark pulled back after finding nothing, but his frustration was evident. "Guess you're clean," he muttered, though his tone suggested he was disappointed. Ryan stepped forward then, his smirk widening as he picked up Liam's cane from where it rested against the wall. The wooden cane, though unremarkable to most, was a lifeline for Liam, one he'd relied on for years. "Well, look at this," Ryan said, holding the cane up as if it were some kind of prize. "Pretty sturdy for an old man's stick. Wonder how it'd hold up if I—" Before anyone could stop him, Ryan snapped the cane across his knee with a loud crack, breaking it clean in two. Pieces of wood clattered to the floor as gasps rippled through the room. Liam's face tightened, but he refused to let his emotions show. The cane was more than just a walking aid. It was a reminder of all he'd endured and overcome. Watching it destroyed in front of him was like watching a piece of his life be torn away. But Ryan didn't stop there. "Looks like you won't be needing this anymore," he said with a laugh, tossing the broken pieces aside. By now, the cafe was dead silent. Even the clinking of dishes in the kitchen had stopped as the staff peeked out nervously to witness the unfolding scene. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Liam, still seated, let out a slow breath. He looked at Mark and Ryan with a calmness that seemed almost supernatural, given the circumstances. "You can take away my cane," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You can insult me, humiliate me, but you'll never take away my dignity." His words hung in the air like a challenge. For a moment, even Mark and Ryan seemed caught off guard. But the moment passed quickly, and Mark leaned in close, his face twisted with anger. "You think you're better than us?" he hissed. "We'll see how tough you are when you're spending the night in a cell for resisting an officer." With that, he reached for his cuffs, snapping them onto Liam's wrists with unnecessary force. The metal bit into his skin, but Liam didn't flinch. He simply straightened in his chair, his quiet defiance shining through, even as Mark yanked him to his feet. The cafe patrons looked on, many of them visibly uncomfortable, but no one dared intervene. The humiliation had reached its peak, and Liam, even in chains, stood taller than the men who sought to tear him down. But what neither Mark nor Ryan knew was that they had already lost. The truth about who Liam was and who he was connected to was about to hit them like a freight train, and there would be no escaping the fallout. As Mark and Ryan began dragging Liam toward the cafe's exit, a hush fell over the room. Customers watched in a mix of shock and discomfort, their silence a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding before them. Liam stumbled slightly without his cane, but he didn't falter. His shoulders were squared, his chin held high, and despite the handcuffs cutting into his wrists, he walked with a dignity that the officers could never take away. Just before they reached the door, Liam stopped abruptly. His sudden resistance caused Mark to jerk back, annoyed. "What now, old man?" Mark snapped, his patience wearing thin. Liam didn't answer. Instead, he turned his head toward the table he had left behind and gestured with a subtle nod. "You forgot something," he said simply, his voice calm and even. Mark followed Liam's gaze and noticed a small card still lying on the table. He rolled his eyes. "You're kidding me," he muttered under his breath, stomping back to grab it. He picked up the card with a dismissive swipe, fully expecting it to be something insignificant. But the moment his eyes landed on the bold lettering across the top, his expression shifted. His arrogance drained away, replaced by a paleness that crept up his neck and into his face. The words on the card seemed to leap off the paper. "Robert Carter, Police Commissioner." Mark froze, staring at the card as if it might burst into flames in his hand. For a moment he was completely still, his mind racing to process what he had just discovered. Slowly, he turned to look at Liam, his eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and panic. Ryan, still standing by the door, noticed the change in his partner's demeanor. "What's the holdup?" he called, smirking. "Don't tell me the old man's bingo card scared you." Mark didn't respond. Instead, he handed the card to Ryan, his movements stiff and mechanical. "Take a look," he said, his voice low and strained. Ryan took the card with a chuckle, but the humor vanished from his face the instant he read the name. His smirk evaporated, replaced by a look of pure dread. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Liam stood silently, watching as the realization dawned on the two officers. The man they had humiliated, mocked, and manhandled wasn't just another cafe patron. He was the father of their boss, the most powerful man in the police department. The gravity of their mistake hit them like a thunderclap. The room seemed to shrink, as the weight of what they had done settled over them. This wasn't just a lapse in judgment, this was career-ending. Ryan turned to Mark, his voice shaky. "What do we do?" he whispered, his earlier confidence now replaced by panic. Before Mark could respond, the sound of the cafe door opening drew everyone's attention. A tall, imposing man stepped inside, his presence commanding instant silence. Commissioner Robert Carter scanned the room with a sharp, practiced gaze, taking in every detail: the shattered cane on the floor, the cuffs on his father's wrists, and the looks of guilt plastered across Mark and Ryan's faces. The cafe patrons seemed to collectively hold their breath as Robert crossed the room in long, deliberate strides. His expression was unreadable, but his clenched jaw and piercing eyes betrayed his anger. When he reached Liam, he stopped and looked down at the handcuffs. For a brief moment, his hardened exterior softened as he met his father's gaze. Liam gave him a small nod, a silent reassurance that he was okay. Robert turned to Mark and Ryan, his face a mask of controlled fury. "Would one of you like to explain to me," he said, his voice low and cold, "why my father is standing here in handcuffs?" Mark stammered, his confidence completely shattered. We didn't know, sir," he began, his voice trembling. "We had no idea he was your—" Robert raised a hand, cutting him off. "It doesn't matter who he is," he said sharply. "Every person deserves respect, whether they're related to me or not. What you've done here is inexcusable." Ryan tried to interject, but Robert silenced him with a glare. "Save it," he snapped. "You've disgraced the badge you wear and the department you represent. You've humiliated a man who has given more to this country than you'll ever understand. And for what? To feed your egos?" The silence in the cafe was deafening. Mark and Ryan stood frozen, their faces pale, their eyes darting around as if looking for an escape. Robert turned back to his father, his voice softening. "Dad," he said quietly, "are you okay?" Liam smiled faintly, his calm demeanor unshaken. "I've been through worse," he replied, his tone light. "But it's good to see you, son." Robert nodded, his expression filled with both pride and regret. He reached down and unlocked the handcuffs, gently removing them from Liam's wrists. Then he straightened and turned back to the officers. "You two," he said, his voice hard once more, "are done here. Turn in your badges. I'll be filing formal charges for misconduct and abuse of authority." Mark and Ryan didn't argue. They knew there was no point. Heads bowed, they left the cafe under the judgmental stares of the other patrons, their careers in tatters. As the door closed behind them, the cafe let out a collective sigh of relief. Robert turned back to Liam, his face softening once more. "I'm sorry for being late," he said, "and for what you had to endure." Liam reached out and patted his son's shoulder. "You handled it the right way," he said with a proud smile. "That's all that matters." The two men sat down together, the tension in the cafe slowly dissolving into the background hum of life resuming. But for everyone who had witnessed what happened that day, the lesson was clear. Respect is not optional, and dignity is unbreakable. The cafe was completely silent as Commissioner Robert Carter turned back toward the table where his father sat. His piercing gaze swept over the scene one last time. The broken cane scattered on the floor, the handcuffs that had only moments ago restrained his father, and the guilty expressions on Mark and Ryan's faces. Every patron in the cafe seemed to hold their breath, waiting for what would come next. Robert's authoritative presence filled the room, leaving no doubt that the situation was now firmly under his control. "Turn in your badges," Robert said coldly, his voice carrying the weight of an unspoken finality. "You are both suspended immediately, pending formal charges." Mark opened his mouth to protest, but Robert's glare stopped him in his tracks. Ryan looked down at his feet, his confidence utterly shattered. Slowly, the two officers removed their badges and placed them on the table. The metallic clink of the badges hitting the wood seemed louder than it should have been, echoing through the room like the final nail in the coffin of their careers. "Now leave," Robert said, his tone unyielding, "before I call someone to escort you out." Mark and Ryan hesitated for a moment, but the sheer weight of their disgrace pushed them into motion. They turned and walked toward the door, their steps heavy and slow. The cafe patrons watched silently, their eyes full of judgment. For these two officers, The walk to the exit felt like the longest walk of their lives. When the door finally closed behind them, a collective exhale seemed to ripple through the cafe. The tension in the room began to dissolve, but the weight of what had happened lingered. Robert turned back to Liam, his expression softening as he knelt beside his father. For a moment, the commanding commissioner was gone, replaced by a son filled with concern and regret. "Dad," he said quietly, "are you hurt? Did they—" Liam shook his head and placed a reassuring hand on Robert's shoulder. "I'm fine, son," he said, his voice steady. "It takes more than a couple of bullies to rattle me." Robert's jaw tightened as he glanced down at the broken cane. "This never should have happened," he said, his voice heavy with guilt. "I'm so sorry I wasn't here sooner." Liam smiled, a faint but warm expression that carried a lifetime of wisdom and resilience. "You were here when it mattered," he said, "and you handled it with integrity. That's what counts." The cafe staff began to emerge from the back, cautiously returning to their stations. Customers whispered quietly among themselves, the earlier fear replaced by a sense of relief and admiration. They had witnessed not only an act of justice, but also the strength of a man who had refused to be broken, even in the face of humiliation. Robert straightened, his commanding presence returning as he addressed the cafe staff. "If anyone has concerns or needs to file a statement about what happened here, please contact my office," he said firmly. Then he looked back at Liam. "Let me help you, Dad." He reached down and picked up the broken pieces of Liam's cane, holding them carefully, as if they were sacred. With a glance at the manager, Robert added, "Send the bill for any damages to my office as well. This won't cost you a dime." The manager nodded quickly, her expression a mix of gratitude and awe. "Of course, Commissioner," she said softly. Robert led Liam toward the door, moving slowly to account for his father's unsteady steps without his cane. But even without it, Liam walked with a dignity that was impossible to ignore. As they passed through the cafe, one of the younger patrons, a man who had been sitting near the counter, stood up and began to clap. It was hesitant at first, but soon others joined in, their applause growing louder and more confident. It wasn't just for Robert's decisive actions, it was for Liam, a man whose quiet strength had spoken louder than any words ever could. Liam paused at the door and turned back to the room. He didn't say anything, but his slight nod of acknowledgement spoke volumes. The applause followed them out onto the street, a fitting end to a moment that had begun with humiliation but ended in justice and respect. For Mark and Ryan, the repercussions of their actions were only just beginning. But for Liam Carter, this was simply another chapter in a life defined by resilience, honor, and an unshakable belief in the power of quiet dignity. As the door to the cafe closed behind them, Liam and Robert stepped into the crisp afternoon air. The applause still echoed faintly in Liam's ears, but he paid it little mind. For him, recognition wasn't the goal. His focus remained steady, his spirit calm, as it had been throughout the ordeal. Robert walked by his father's side, the broken pieces of the cane tucked under one arm. He was still reeling from what he had witnessed, the blatant disrespect, the abuse of authority, but the calm presence of Liam beside him served as a grounding force. "Dad," Robert said after a long silence, his voice heavy with emotion, "I don't think I'll ever forgive myself for what happened back there. They shouldn't have treated you like that. You deserved better." Liam stopped, turning to face his son. His weathered face softened, and a small smile crept onto his lips. "Robert," he said gently, "what matters isn't what they did. It's how you responded. You showed strength, fairness, and integrity when it counted. That's what makes a good leader and a good man." Robert looked down, his jaw tightening as he fought back the emotions threatening to surface. "I should have been there sooner," he said quietly. Liam placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his grip firm but reassuring. "You can't be everywhere at once," he said. "What matters is that you came when it mattered most. You set things right. That's all anyone can ask for." The two men stood there for a moment, the bustling city around them fading into the background. It wasn't the first time Liam had guided his son through a difficult moment, and Robert knew it wouldn't be the last. With a deep breath, Robert straightened, his resolve returning. "Let's get you a new cane," he said, his voice steady once more. Liam chuckled softly, the sound warm and full of life. "I've made it this far," he said. "A little longer without one won't hurt." As they walked down the street together, side by side, Liam's steps were slow but steady. Despite the events of the day, his pride and dignity remained intact, as unshakable as ever. And for Robert, the image of his father, calm, composed, and unwavering in the face of adversity, would serve as a reminder of the kind of man he strived to be. Back at the cafe, the patrons who had witnessed the scene began to reflect on what they had seen. The story of the elderly veteran and his son, the commissioner, would be told and retold in the days to come, spreading a powerful message about respect, resilience, and the quiet strength of those who refuse to be broken by injustice. But for Liam, it wasn't about the applause or the whispers of admiration. It was about staying true to himself, no matter the circumstance. And as father and son disappeared into the city, one thing was certain. Liam Carter's legacy wasn't just one of service to his country. It was one of unyielding dignity, a lesson the world needed to remember. As Liam and Robert walked away from the cafe, the weight of the day hung in the air like the fading echo of a storm. The broken pieces of Liam's cane in Robert's hand were a stark reminder of the humiliation his father had endured. Yet they also symbolized something far greater: resilience in the face of cruelty. For Liam, the ordeal was another test in a lifetime full of challenges. He had been underestimated before, mocked for his appearance, and judged by those who didn't understand his story. But as he glanced at his son walking beside him, he felt a quiet sense of pride. Not in himself, but in the man Robert had become. "Son," Liam said, his voice breaking the comfortable silence between them, "you know this isn't just about what happened today." Robert turned to look at his father, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Liam stopped walking, taking a moment to steady himself. Despite his age and the day's events, his posture was strong, his presence commanding. "It's about the choices we make when no one's watching," he said, his tone firm yet kind. "Those two men didn't just disgrace themselves. They failed the people they were supposed to protect. But you didn't. You chose integrity, even when it would have been easier to look the other way." Robert felt his chest tighten at his father's words. "I just did what was right," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "And that," Liam replied, "is what separates leaders from cowards." The moment hung between them, unspoken but deeply felt. Robert nodded, the weight of his father's words settling into his heart like a promise he would carry forever. As they reached the corner where they would part ways, Robert hesitated. "Let me take you home," he offered, his protective instincts kicking in. Liam smiled softly, shaking his head. "I've got it from here," he said. "You've done more than enough for one day." Robert handed his father the broken cane, his hand lingering for a moment. "You'll always have me, Dad," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "No matter what." Liam's eyes softened as he looked at his son. "I know," he said, "and that's why I'm not worried about this world, because of people like you." They shared a quiet smile before Liam turned and began walking down the street, his steps slower but no less determined. Robert stood there for a moment, watching his father disappear into the distance. The sight filled him with a mix of pride and sorrow, knowing how much his father had endured, yet remained unshaken. Back at the cafe, the story of the confrontation was already spreading. The customers who had witnessed the scene couldn't stop talking about it. The quiet strength of the elderly veteran, the powerful presence of his son, and the downfall of the arrogant officers who had overstepped their bounds. The cafe manager posted a picture of Liam's broken cane on social media that same afternoon, along with a caption that read, "Respect isn't earned by a badge or a uniform, it's earned by how you treat others. Today we saw the true meaning of dignity." The post went viral within hours, with thousands of people sharing it alongside messages of support and calls for accountability. Liam's story became a beacon of hope, a reminder that quiet strength and integrity could still triumph in a world often clouded by arrogance and injustice. But for Liam, the day wasn't about going viral. It wasn't about the applause or the recognition. It was about standing firm in the face of disrespect and teaching others, especially his son, that dignity could never be taken away unless you allowed it. And as the world turned its attention to the story of Liam Carter, the man himself walked home, his heart full, his spirit unbroken, and his legacy secure.